Welcome back. And we'll go now to where we left off last time. Now, I believe that where we had left off, we were done. We were just finishing with the first of the expulsions. Well, really the second, because we had studied, though not read, the decree of the expulsion from England of the Jews, about whom we had learned a great deal about the previous week when we, so that's going back now 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it was, 3 lessons perhaps, when we learned all about the blood libels and Charles of Monmouth or William of Monmouth and so forth. So what we're going to do today, and I've mentioned them in passing, is to talk about the Iberian Peninsula, a bit of a special situation. Now, I'm not going to give you all the history of the Jews of Spain and all the history of the Spanish and what they dealt with, both from the top, which was the Christianized part, and which where the Reconquista happened. But I am going to remind you a little bit of the history, just so you'll have the context in case you're not up to date on all the things that occurred. Throughout the medieval period, Christian Spain was very similar in its treatment of Jews to the stories we've read now from a few from Germany during the Crusades we read. I had to pick here, I had to pick a little here, pick a little there. You could have, with the exception of the Crusades in England, which were really not much of a factor because they started there. It was as far, obviously, west as you could go. Most of the testimonials to the Crusades we have are from further east. But aside from that, a lot of what happened overlapped and happened in all those different countries where the Jews lived, and they weren't in a lot of them at this point. And in fact, we're moving to an area that really finally gives us a large, relatively large population of Jews. Throughout a lot of these medieval periods, there were Jews in Babylon that we haven't spoken about. They were not really subjected to any kind of special hatred by the Jews that were there. After Islam came through, we are going to talk about Islam, spend half a class, maybe a whole class, I haven't decided yet, on what happened with Islam. And then we're going to do World War II in the middle 20th century, and then end this all with what's happening right now, but only in brief because I've given a whole lecture about it. But there were whole portions of the world where I don't want to say the treatment of Jews was wonderful, but it wasn't horrible. Where those two parts of the world, though, met at this point, where there were a lot of Jews, was in Spain. It was in the Iberian Peninsula. This is where Christendom and Islam met. But of course, Islam doesn't even come around until the 7th century. So for a very long time, the history of, well, not a very long time, but a few centuries, the history of the Iberian Peninsula is the history of its Christianization. And in fact, it wasn't such a long time. In the 6th century, that's to say the 500s, Spain was Christianized when a king there named, I think his name was Ricard, converted to Catholicism. That would have been in around 585, 586, 87 CE. And that's really when the situation for the Jews who are there, and they had been there because they'd come up from Africa primarily, began to deteriorate. They were among the only peoples who lived there who refused to convert to Christianity. And that was why. By the 7th century, as I say, it was pretty much like it was in England and in France and in Germany and the Rhine Valley and so forth. Our small but intrepid population of European Jews were being treated in a very similar manner. But Spain is different because Spain was the first of Europe, and it took a long time before the other parts of Europe had any Jews that this was going to bother them, and it never really was a huge issue for them the way it was for Christians in those later places. But this is the place where the Jews and the Christians, I'm sorry, the Muslims and the Christians were going to meet, and the Jews were going to get stuck in between. And it's one of the most significant and notable places that it happened. Because in the 8th century, in 711 CE, to be exact, the Moors, which were sort of a mixed group of North African Muslims who had gotten there through the conquest, through the Arab conquest, the Muslim conquest. They crossed over from North Africa And they began a battle as they had throughout the more eastern areas where they had influence. They tried to take on Europe. And this was their first stand against Europe. There would be others consequently, but this was their first and most major stand against Europe. And they were quite successful. They engaged in battles with the Christian, they were then known as the Visigoths, the soldiers there, killed their monarch, and really took over almost the entire peninsula. Little tiny ridge maybe at the top that was going back and forth much longer than the rest of it was. And this is the beginning of Muslim rule in Spain. I know a lot of you have been to Spain. I have not been to Spain, but I've seen plenty of pictures, and we all know that Moorish rule, which went on for roughly 250, 275, maybe 300 years, depending on where you were, generally is known as Al-Andalus. A lot of the architecture there, many of the names that are today part of modern Spain go back to this period. For the Jews, it was considered a golden age. Now, that's not to say that the Jews did not have a lesser status. Jews and Christians both living under Spain, although Jews had it better than the Christians did. Jews and Christians both were considered dhimmi. When we get to the part of the class where we maybe spend as much as one full session on the history of Islamic anti-Semitism, which is not a long history, we will talk about dhimmi. And to be a dhimmi was not a great thing. And of course, it depended on which Muslims you were under and what their beef with you was. It turns out they had more beef with the Christians. Why? Because they had fought the Christians for the land. So Christians had a much harder time under Islamic rule, no matter who it was, the relatively more gentle first period known as the Golden Age, and the two later periods, of course, which became difficult for everybody. So this Moorish rule, and maybe you've been exposed to it from a Jewish history class. Jews became part of the military, even part of the civilian leadership in some places. The rules of the dhimmi, which were that if you were a monotheistic group, which fit both the Christians and Jews, that you were basically treated okay, not great, but okay, depending on who was doing it. For the Jews under the Moorish rule during this period of 8th through the 10th century, okay was pretty good. In fact, it was quite good. It ended eventually in the 11th to 12th century, and this was due to two very, very related events. Because of what had been happening with the Reconquista, that would continue until 1492, other Muslims took advantage of the situation and moved up, and they were much more militant people. There was first the Almoravids, and then the ones that were much more problematic for the Jews, the Almohads. Everywhere they went, the situation of the Jews and their condition deteriorated somewhat. And because of this, many Jews, believe it or not, fled north. They fled north to Christian Spain, which would not turn out to be a great idea in the end. Others fled south. I'll give you an example of one of the most famous of those who fled. He's generally associated as a figure of the Golden Age, but he was really at the very tail end, and that was Maimonides. And I forgot to write down his exact years, but he's around the time that the Almohads are arriving. And he and his family, they escape to Egypt. And in Egypt, and you've probably heard these stories, he, as a physician, had to the extent that there were physicians back then, but they knew how to use herbs and they knew how to do things that were helpful. It wasn't all a bunch of just bleeding people. And he became the physician to the caliph there. There is weirdly there are rumors that Maimonides and his family. Maimonides is Rabbi Moshe Bar Maimon, also known as the Rambam. Maimonides is his Greek appellation. Moshe ben Maimon means Moses, son of Maimon. Maimon was his father, was apparently a very wealthy guy. And Rambam is the acronym that many rabbis get. Rashi, for instance, is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki Rashi. So the Rambam is probably the next most famous. There was another one named Ramban who was around at this time. We're going to actually talk about him in a minute, who was we called Nachmanides, very different than Rambam, Maimonides. Maimonides, there's a rumor that he converted to Islam, and that later on, some of his responsa about could Jews convert away from being Jewish were used to allow Jews who had been forcibly converted away to repent and return without any necessity of reconversion. This creates it was an old rabbinical standard, but it updated it, which says Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisraelu, that a Jew, even if he sinned, meaning became an apostate, continues to be a Jew. And that was really, among other things, a statement of ethnic Judaism, of ethno-religious Judaism. Remember, the definition of what exactly is a Jew is very easy on one hand, if you're willing to accept the ancient rabbinical, the child of a Jewish mother, but also very difficult when people look at us as a religion, which we're not. And any humanistic Jew doesn't understand that. I got to teach the whole Intro to Humanistic Judaism course again. But an ethnicity, not really the way Americans use ethnicity, but okay, maybe it applies in some ways. Race, again, made up, but it doesn't fit the American definition of race, ethnicities, races, things like that, because we, in our deepest ancestry, and I don't mean the mythos of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I mean the reality of the confederation, the formation of the Confederation of Israel and later Judea, as it's not described in the Bible, but as it is described in archaeological and sociological studies of archaeological patterns that have been discovered. It turns out the Israelite Confederation did not have its roots outside of Israel. Its roots were inside Israel, according to many a scholar, which I've written about in depth, but other people have too. And it's actually a little add-on in my Haggadah. So when we use our Temple Haggadah, there's a page for that. There's a supplement. I publish it every year in my commentary for Pesach, so you'll see it again there a week or two before the holiday. What to call us, though, is very difficult. But to call us a religion is very inaccurate. And this is when that was beginning to come forward, to be obvious. Maimonides seemed to have also had less problem with people who converted to Islam, because Islam is purely monotheistic, than those who converted to Christianity, but the solution was the same for both. So these were the kinds of pressures that were on them. And this is already now in the 11th and 12th century CE. This is before things became worse, and they did become worse. Everywhere that particularly Almohads went, things got terrible. But very quickly, so as I said, they went in some cases to the north, to the Christians. But then Christian Spain became one of the worst places for Jews. The church became, in a way that was much more official than we saw in other communities north of them, became increasingly and openly antagonistic toward the Jews. Papal bulls, which, as we saw last week, were issued sometimes, frequently, even if necessary, to protect Jews, were also being issued now at this time, let's say the mid-13th century, to prohibit Jews, for instance, in Spain in particular, from building synagogues without permission, specifically, as it had always been understood, sometimes officially and sometimes not, forbidding Jews from converting anyone, but also forbidding contact between Jews and Christians for anything. And that was not what had happened up further in the north before their expulsions. Maybe they didn't get expelled in enough time, or maybe it was the fact that there were more Jews in the south they had to worry about. Now, we don't know exactly what the populations are. We never know what the populations are of anywhere. The best we can do is extrapolate based on this traveler's information, some Jewish traveler usually, or that chronicler's information, and we have relatively little of that. But we do believe that there were more Jews in the south there for all kinds of reasons than there were in the north, and that the Jews in the north would not really begin to increase until their expulsion. And later, one of the chapters that we're going to have here, one of the lessons will be about anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. So as you can already tell, the course doesn't go as much in chronological order as I'd like it to, because we have to start skipping around geographically a little bit as well. But it's generally in chronological order. The origins of the ghetto, which in Spain was called the Juderia, were in the Iberian Peninsula. There was also some new tools that the church, primarily under the leadership of several of these monastic traditions, the Dominicans, were particularly anti-Semitic. And these traditions were very, very strong in the Iberian Peninsula, especially when it came to dealing with the Jews, but also because, remember, they were part of the recapturing. There was nowhere that Christians had to go before where they had to take back something that they had that was theirs, or that they assumed or felt was theirs. And in a sense, it was theirs because the Moors came from North Africa, and the Christians were largely native Spaniards who had converted. So culturally, they were different, but than their predecessors, but they were the original inhabitants by and large. So one of these new things that happened in the mid-13th century was the idea that they were going to pressure or convince, as they would say, Jews to convert to Christianity. This became a big push, and King James of Aragon was primarily behind enforcing that. The Spanish monarchy, as a result, along with the Dominicans, started to take, unusually, at least in larger numbers like this, an interest in Jewish philosophy and religion. Now, in the Iberian Peninsula, until those days, the Jews were part of the intellectual discourse. The saviors of Greek philosophy, the first time around, were the Spaniards. They were the Spanish Muslims during that golden age. They and the Jews translated so much of Plato and Aristotle and all these others from Greek into Arabic. Maimonides wrote an entire dictionary of Neo-Aristotelian terms in Hebrew and in Judeo-Arabic, really. And there was, of course, also Judeo-Spanish, Ladino, the language that they learned and spoke together. And it was very mutually intelligible. I know that it's pegged as a different language. It was not as different as Yiddish eventually became from German, because Yiddish moved east and German stayed in Germany, whereas Ladino, to the extent that it changed, it was more under Turkish influence. But in the Iberian Peninsula, it was more or less mutually intelligible. But the reason they were learning all of this philosophy and religion is because they wanted to try to convince Jews to convert. And the way to do that is to learn more about the Jews. And this created a whole brand new thing in the 13th century, as they were continuing to win more and more land back, called forced disputations. There was one that was extraordinarily famous. There were many of them that were held, but this one is very famous because the participant from the Jewish side, the interlocutor, if you will, on the Jewish side, is somebody important to Jewish history, very important to Jewish history, much more so than many of these chroniclers and itinerant teachers and so forth that we have information about the Crusades or some population numbers or this and that, because this was none other than Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Rabbi Moses, son of Nachman, whose acronym is Ramban, with an N at the end rather than an M, like Rambam. People often confuse them because of that, and because each of them got a Greek appellation as well. Maimonides is Maimonides, and Nachman, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, his is Nachmanides, and that's what I'm going to refer to him going forward, Nachmanides. or Ramban, but Nachmanides usually. So this rush, which is going to continue, this not rush, this urge to convert the Jews, which continues, picks up steam in the 13th century. By 1263, a king named James in Barcelona was convening a special council of Dominican and Jewish clergy people and forcing the Jews to debate the Dominicans. The Dominicans had a little advantage because while the Jews didn't sit around worrying about Christianity very much until they had to, and this already was not so new by 1263, because the Christians had been in Barcelona for some time then. Forgot to write that number down. Some of you who've been there may know it and can tell me or remind me. But in any case, they were forced to debate not just Dominicans, but Dominicans who were formerly Jews. And this debate, this disputation that most agree took place, I don't see any reason to doubt it. Nachmanides is a real person who we have a great deal of attestation of his life. He wrote an enormous amount of commentaries, and they're clearly his. I should mention he was very different than Rambam. This is just an aside. He was much more mystical. Rambam, with his rationalism, which was extreme, his Neo-Aristotelianism, represents a kind of a class of Jews who were still in conversation with Muslims about Greek philosophy and so forth. And he got out of there before the Christians came in. His real persecutors were other Muslims, the Almohads in particular, and that's why he went to Egypt. Those who could afford to engage in wonderful academic debate with their fellow Christians, St. Augustine, by the way, was one of that school as well, and others, not that Maimonides had direct contact with him, but Averroes he did. And that privilege was soon gone. And the Jews either absorbed into the Christian Reconquista or they began to leave. The Jews who were left became quite mystical. And this is a phenomenon that happens wherever there's heavy persecution. Jews turn inwardly mystical. Mystical Judaism of this type, and this is not when the Zohar was written, but we're getting close. The Zohar is the giant series of books of what became European Kabbalah. And I did a couple sessions on that earlier this year or last year, I can't remember, on a Monday class. But these mystical systems always have this special place for the Jews in them. And that's not an accident, because the more Jews are feeling persecuted, the more they want to feel themselves as being part of God's special plan, that the persecution means something. And so mystical outbreaks are very common where there are increased anti-Semitic pressures. And in any case, Ramban was part of that. And his commentary on the Torah, which is beautiful, is also very, very mystical. He draws upon mystical traditions going back to the rabbis of the Talmudic age and the Midrashic days. And sometimes even on Saturday mornings, we read a little bit of him. He's not our big go-to, but he is somebody that we read, and he's considered one of the top 3 or 4. Anyway, he was a tremendous scholar and a leader of the community, and he was forced into this debate by the king, King James, who set him against a Dominican named Pablo Cristiani, Paul the Christian. And only a Jew who had been converted to Christianity would choose a name like that. This is a guy who seriously wanted to prove his Jewish bona fides, if you will, and he was forced to debate him. And we're not going to study the record of the debate; it's just too much for a class like this. But he did keep a record of it. It is still read today. What's interesting about what happened in it is that even the king, and he, at least as Ramban quotes him, even the king believes that it was Ramban who won. Christianity and the Dominicans, of course, they claimed victory, but they were in charge. Ramban says he won, and he tells the story about how after the debate, King James gave Ramban 300 gold coins and stated that he has never heard anyone so wrong defend his case so well. That was the at least the outcome of the trial as quoted by Ramban, but we have it in other sources, I believe. Ramban could no longer live in Spain, and this is true. He left Spain. He immigrated to Israel, and from there we don't know what happened to him. The historical record only speaks of him. Well, there's one rumor, but I don't believe it's an eyewitness that he made his way to the wall in Jerusalem and then was trampled by horses there, where he died, having reached the holy of holies, as close as he could to the temple. I don't believe that's true. Anyway, I'm going to do something I have not done in this class before. I'm going to take a joke break, because this is, and I hope I do this break correct. I'm going to tell you a funny story about that's supposedly an Italian. The Italians did things differently. And by the way, a lot of these Spanish Jews wound up in Italy. That's why there were so many similarities. And many of them wound up going to the Greek Isles and so forth. But we haven't gotten to their expulsion quite yet. Though I think if I asked you all at the beginning of this class, what's the one year you can remember that featured a pretty prominent expulsion, you would know that it's coming up in our timeline here, 1492, the Alhambra Decree. But this is the joke I want to tell you. I hope I do this right. So several centuries ago, the Pope decreed that all the Jews must either convert to Catholicism or leave, and this takes place in Italy. There was a huge outcry from the Jewish community. So the Pope offered a deal. He would stage, as we know actually happened, a religious debate with the leader of the Jewish community. And if the Jews won, they could stay. But if the Pope won, they'd have to convert or leave. The Jewish people met, and they picked a spokesman, an aged and wise rabbi, to represent them in the debate. However, the rabbi did not speak Italian. And so both sides agreed that since they could not communicate with each other, it would have to be a silent debate. So you can tell it's a joke. On the chosen day, the Pope and the rabbi sat opposite one another. The Pope raised his hand and showed 3 fingers. The rabbi looked back and raised 1 finger, shook it at the Pope. Next, the Pope waved his finger around his head. The rabbi responded by pointing to the ground on where he sat. The Pope brought out a communion wafer, the consecrated wafer, and a chalice of wine. The rabbi pulled out an apple. With that, the Pope stood up and declared himself defeated, saying that the rabbi was simply too clever and the Jews were saved, they could stay. Later, the cardinals met with the Pope and asked him what had happened. The Pope said, "First, I held up 3 fingers to represent the Trinity. He responded by holding up a single finger, shaking it at me to remind me there's still only one God common to both of our beliefs. Then I waved my finger around my head to show him that God is all around us. And he responded by pointing to the ground to show that God is also right here with us. I pulled out the wine, the consecrated wafer, to show that God absolves us of all of our sins, but he pulled out an apple to remind me of the original sin. He beat me on every move, and I could not continue." Meanwhile, the Jews were gathering around the rabbi to ask how he'd won. The rabbi says, I don't have a clue. First, he told me that we had 3 days to get out of Italy, so I shook my finger. I said, no. Then he tells me the whole country is going to be cleared of Jews. I told him, we're staying right here. And then what? What happened next? Asked a woman. He says, who the hell knows? He took out his lunch, so I took out mine. I figured there was, at some point in this class, we did a little bit of humor. It's not a funny story, I'm telling you. But I love that joke. And it's the only place where you can tell a disputation joke is after what happened to the Ramban. Anyway, I know at least one of you probably heard it. Well, Jamie heard it because it's a little bit famous. But we're going to move on now to the bad days. So the story of 1492, as I'm sure you're aware, and I mentioned it already once, is not just the story of Columbus's journey. You remember that poem? I am old enough, sadly, to have remembered this poem. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? We all did. I think our children, my children anyway, are the generation that didn't have to hear that nonsense anymore. Anyway, 1492 represents the end of any important Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula. This is the end of the Reconquista. They have won, and the continuation into the areas of the Reconquista and the ultimate takeover of it by the anti-Semitic Christians. On July 30th of that year, the entire Jewish community, again, estimated in Spain to have been quite large at 200,000, were expelled. And then we're going to read now, as we've done throughout the class, we're going to read all right, share. We're going to read the actual, not the notes, this one here. We're going to read the actual declaration of expulsion. And then we're going to talk about some reasons that Spain was unique and different. And we may end a moment or two early, although I don't think we're going to. So this was, by the way, in the, as I said, July 30th. It was timed, and this is a very, very anti-Semitic kind of thing. And remember, they had Jews. They knew Jews. The Dominicans had their own Jews, apostates. And these apostates would tell them things, as we already saw in the disputations, but other things too, ways to hurt the Jews. July 30th, as far as I know that year, I've never looked it up in a calendar, but I know it's true, was coming up on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, and I think it's even referenced in the decree, which of course is the day that Jews traditionally mourn the destruction of both temples. One was actually destroyed on the 9th of Av. That's where the date came from. The other, maybe around that time, we don't know, in the year 70, certainly around that time. And in addition to that, all of the woes of the Jews have been added to it, despite the fact that we have a separate Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Day. In fact, there's two. There's the International Day of Observance in January, and then there's the one that the Jewish community of Israel, it was actually the Knesset selected it, that's during the period of the Omer, between Passover and Shavuot. This is really when, for instance, Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews, many other Orthodox Jews, will remember the Holocaust. It's just a terrible day. And the Holocaust, there were things that were done on the 9th of Av to particularly hurt the Jews during this period. It's the only other, by the way, full 25-hour fast on the Jewish calendar. The Jews have a lot of minor fasts, some observed more than others, but they're all sunrise to sunset. The only two that are not are Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. So it's a little salt in the wound. This is a little bit of an aside, because we're not going to do the history of the Holocaust. We're going to just talk about it, the fact that it happened. It's its own class. It's its own, PhD. But it happened that my father-in-law, my former father-in-law, blessed memory, his town in what was then Poland, but is today in Belarus, called Evia, the intelligentsia of the town were taken out into the forest and mass murdered on Tisha B'Av, on the eve of Tisha B'Av. And that was not a legend, it happened. A lot of eyewitnesses to that. The little community that he came from was one of the most well-documented of small shtetl during the Holocaust. And if anybody's interested in why, I can tell you another time. All right, here's the decree. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, remember they were co-joined monarchs, like William and Mary. By the grace of God, King and Queen of Castile, and then it goes on to all the other places that they were king and queen of, to the Prince Lord Juan, our very dear and much beloved son, and to the other royal children, and there's a big giant list of the nobles and the authorities throughout the entire country, every place they had conquered or reconquered, as they thought of it, and to all individual Jews of those places. Whereas we have been informed that in these our kingdoms there were some wicked Christians who Judaized and apostatized from our holy Catholic faith, This is probably made up, but this is a thing that happens. The rumors that Christians are reverting or converting to Judaism. The great cause of which was interaction between these Jews and these Christians. In the Cortes, the parliament, which we held in the city of Toledo in the past year, we ordered the separation of the said Jews in all the cities, towns, and villages of our kingdoms and lordships, and commanded that they be given Jewish quarters and separated places where they should live, hoping that by their separation, the situation would remedy itself. And if you've traveled through Spain, I know a lot of you have been to some of these places and you saw the Jewish quarter and so forth. It's not that there wasn't one before the Christians, but it wasn't enforceably Jewish. It was just a place where Jews happened to live. Here it became enforceably Jewish, and so did contact between Jews and Christians, which was a normative thing of Jewish life further in the north, and never deteriorated to this point because there were fewer of them, and ultimately they were expelled at an earlier stage because of, those Christians controlled those countries and didn't have a war to put up with. In any case, separated place where they should live, hoping that by their separation, the situation would remedy itself. Furthermore, we procured and gave orders that inquisition should be made. And as is very well known, and accordingly, we are informed by the inquisitors and by other devout persons, that great injury has resulted and still results since the Christians have continued and continue to engage in social interaction and communication, that they have had means and ways they can to subvert and steal faithful Christians from our holy Catholic faith and to separate them from it. And just another little brief here, let me put a little marker there. They're talking about, remember the Inquisition, which we are gonna discuss briefly. The Inquisition was not directed against Jews, no matter what Mel Brooks says. It may be one of the funniest, most hysterical scenes in a very strange movie, The History of the World, part 1, is that what it's called? Part 1, right, because he did part 2 recently as a kind of a sitcom, where he's got the Hasidic Jews, who, by the way, don't exist yet, with the payas and the beards and everything, from Poland. That kind of does exist, that there are Jews in Poland by 1500, but there's really not the community that it will grow into. That they were the ones that were the subject of the Inquisition. Inquisitions are inquisitions into the faith and loyalty of Christians, not of Jews. They are directed against Christians. So even though it's a catchy tune, the Inquisition, I don't know, you all know it. It is not, it did a lot of damage to any hope that we could teach this to people in a cute way. You can't, first of all, it's not a cute topic, but what they're talking about here is that Inquisitions were held against Christians, which revealed that these Christians were continuing to engage in social action from the Jews, with the Jews, and that the Jews were using it as an opportunity to convert them. I don't believe there's any evidence of this. And there's been a lot of books written about Jewish treatment in Christian Spain, both before and after the expulsion. To continue on. So this was done to draw them to themselves and subvert them to their own wicked belief and conviction, meaning that of the Jews, instructing them in the ceremonies and observances of their law, holding meetings at which they read and teach that which people must hold, and believing according to the law, achieving that the Christians and their children be circumcised, and giving them books from which they may read their prayers, and declaring to them the fasts that they must keep, and joining with them to read and teach them the history of their law. Again, there's no indication that any of this happened, but there would have been a fear of it because they were, with this Reconquista, coming upon a quite sizable Jewish community in many areas, and they were unaccustomed to it, indicating to them the festivals before they occurred, advising them of what in them they are to hold and observe, carrying to them and giving to them from their houses unleavened bread and meats ritually slaughtered, instructing them about the things from which they must refrain, as much in eating as in other things, in order to observe their law, persuading them as much as they can to hold and observe the law of Moses, convincing them that there is no other law or truth except that one. They proved, this proved by many statements and confessions of Christians, both from these same Jews, well, I guess from Jews too, and from those who have been perverted and enticed by them, those are the Christians, which has redounded to the great injury, detriment, and opprobrium of our holy Catholic faith. Notwithstanding that we were informed of the great part of this before now, and we knew that the true remedy for all these injuries and inconveniences was to prohibit all interaction between the said Jews and Christians and banish them from all of our kingdoms, we desire to content ourselves by commanding them to leave all cities, towns, and villages, because every day it is found and appears that the said Jews increase in continuing their evil and wicked purpose wherever they live and congregate. Notice how this is, again, ascribing to Jews a great deal of power that they do not possess. And in fact, we know that there are historical memories that the Jews did hold power with the Muslims. The Jews were wealthy. They did own land. This was a whole different world. This is what they're really trying to change. And the purpose of it is to either convert them or get rid of them entirely. Therefore, we, with the counsel and advice of prelates and so forth, resolve to order the said Jews and Jewesses of our kingdoms to depart, never to return, or come back to them or to any of them. And concerning this, we command this our charter to be given, by which we order all Jews and Jewesses of whatever age they may be who live, reside, and exist in our said kingdoms and lordships, as much as those who are natives as those who are not, who by whatever manner or whatever cause have come to live and reside therein, that by the end of the month of July next of the present year, they depart from all these our said realms and lordships, along with their sons and daughters, men servants and maidservants, Jewish familiars, those who are great as well as the lesser folk, of whatever age they may be, and they shall not dare to return to those places, nor to reside in them, nor to live in any part of them, neither temporarily on the way to somewhere else, nor in any other manner, under pain of the penalty of death and the confiscation of their possessions. And we command and forbid that any person or persons who shall dare to receive, protect, defend, nor hold publicly or secretly any Jew or Jewess beyond the date of the end of July of the succeeding year, under pain of losing all their possessions. Long list follows. And so that the said Jews and Jewesses during the stated period of time, they may enter, sell, trade, and alienate, meaning get rid of, all their movable and rooted possessions, and dispose of them freely and at their will, and no one shall harm them, nor injure them, nor wrong shall be done to them against justice, as long as they do not export gold or silver or coined money or other things prohibited by the laws of our kingdoms, excepting merchandise and things that are not prohibited. In other words, they were to leave with relatively nothing. That was what was going to happen. Given in our city of Granada, the 31st day of the month of March, it was in July that it would take place in the following year, timed to Tisha B'Av, and that was that. Now, who left? Who stayed? We don't know. To this day, we don't know who left and who stayed and what the numbers were. It's impossible for us to have that information because it was just not properly recorded. The entire project was the idea primarily of a man who would go on to be featured in the Mel Brooks film, but he was also the scourge of many, many Christians as well, and not just of the Jews. He was Father Tomás de Torquemada. You remember the joke in the film, Torquemada, you can't Torquemada anything, right? Which I thought was really the only really funny part of it. Torquemada believed that as long as the Jews remained in Spain, that they were going to, where he got this idea from, because there's no evidence that it was happening, they were going to influence tens of thousands of Christians. No, in fact, what he was really worried about is that many Jews had been converting to Christianity. And the people that they were actually talking about and that they don't reveal, it seems that they were converts to Christianity. And that this is a way that many Jews in Central Europe, in Western Europe, and now in Spanish Christian Europe, this was a way that many of them chose to survive. There were a large number of Jews who converted over time from what we can surmise from different things that we've read, the different documents that we have, and Jews bemoaning this and so forth. That's what this was really about. What did the Jews, the larger number of Jews, do after this decree? Well, there were a number of different strategies. A large minority of them certainly left. What number? Impossible to know. They went everywhere. They went especially to North Africa, heavily to Turkey, and they would remain in Turkey for a very long time and take Ladino with them. They went to Italy. They went to the Greek islands. A tiny number of them, we know for a fact, were on Columbus's ships. Columbus was not Jewish. I know that we really, for a while, wanted him to be. I'm glad he's not, because he was a horrible human being. And not like some of our apologists say today, oh, he didn't know any better. That's just how things were. He was so bad. He was punished for his cruelty by these two cruel monarchs when he got back. They heard some of the things he had done, and it was like, whoa, ooh, hey, listen, it's 15th century. You can get away with a lot, but not that. He was pretty bad. Other Jews, however, it seems, made the decision to stay. Leaving was too difficult for them. Were they a minority? Were they a majority? We don't know. They chose to practice their Judaism in secret, even as they converted. These people were known to other Christians around the area, and Jews especially. They began to call them Marranos, meaning, I think, a swine or pig of some kind, in Aramaic, in Ladino, I guess. Today, we call them crypto Jews, or another word we use for them, anusim. Anusim was a popular one when I was living in Miami. To be anus means to be forced to do something. The anusim, by the way, they pop up everywhere. People, particularly in the Americas, South America, Central America, you will hear these stories, and that's how I met them in Miami. They were not Cubans. The Cuban Jewish population was entirely Ashkenazic, and almost entirely, well, not entirely, but a lot of them just pre or post Holocaust. But there are a lot of Jews who purportedly came over with these early migrations to Central and South America. And when they came to Miami, we would hear a lot of Judaizing stories, the rabbis. There was one rabbi in my neighborhood who made a whole cottage industry out of converting these people back to Judaism. And the families had stories, and we're still conducting these little strange practices of Judaism. Others, though, rejected Judaism entirely, just like had been happening, and became sincere Christians. But it didn't really seem to matter whether you were sincere or not. Torquemada was afraid of you nonetheless. And once he got rid of the professing Jews, he knew that he still had Jews there that did not believe properly, and he aimed his Inquisition at them. The Inquisition, of course, being for any means necessary, including torture, although not always, to get you to confess your sins. Getting a Jew who's a Jew to confess their sins means nothing. That's why Jews were not the subject of the Inquisition. The Jews were the subject of the expulsion. Professing Jews were ordered to leave. It was the secret Jews and the people that he didn't believe, and he didn't believe most of them, were the ones that he went after. A lot of the Jews, by the way, went to Portugal too. That became a problematic place for them later, but that's a separate, maybe I'll give you a little information about them next week. And so what happened is that a concept began to arise among the many, many who converted. Let's say it was somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000. We don't really know, because we don't know how many were there in the first place. But a concept arose about these people known as the limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood. And it was those who, due to having impure blood were suspect that the Inquisition turned, and that was Jews, Jewish converts to Christianity. Jewish converts to Christianity were accused of every kind of thing you could imagine, both the normative Jewish behaviors and practices that any Jew would be engaged in, that could endanger them, not eating pork, not eating on Yom Kippur, lighting candles on Shabbat, or some kind of lights on Friday night, on and on and on. But also things that anti-Semites had determined Jews did. Using your conversion to Christianity to invite, to get yourself invited into a church, to steal a wafer to torture and commit host desecration, and these other kinds of things. There was almost no limit to the things these Jews were accused of. There are many, many chronicles of them. Some of these inquisitions were huge staged shows and staged show trials. Portugal was kind of infamous for that, and I may bring a description of that next time. This policy of limpieza de sangre, though, introduced something new to anti-Semitism, something that we really hadn't seen since early times. So remember that debate we had about, is it Jewish beliefs you oppose, or is it the Jew? Well, one could, I suppose, make claims that what started as opposition to Jewish beliefs early on became opposition to the Jew. I think that's the phenomenon we're seeing right now, although using the word Zionist, because we're not talking about the academic discourse about Zionism that Shaul Magid and Daniel Boyarson are engaged in, et cetera. We're talking about the things I showed you all in September, in the February presentation I made, where Zio or Zionists are just becoming substitutes, as they've always been for the right. But that's still beliefs. It's not, it's beliefs, and it's the person who holding the beliefs, but it hasn't yet crossed the border to something constitutional about the Jews. It had existed in antiquity, those early Greek things and Latin things that we read, but it kind of died away after that. And here it makes a return, a grand return, because the Jews that are being the most persecuted here are not the ones in Turkey or Italy or the Greek islands or wherever it is that they, North Africa, wherever they went, or Egypt. They're not the ones this is happening to. The ones this is happening to are the Jews who converted. And it begins to become something that we see in law, even before the expulsion. There was a statute of purity of blood that was promulgated in Toledo, some almost 45 years before this, in 1449, because even then Jews were converting of their own free will, because it was a survival tactic, or because they believed in Christianity. Many of them were very sincere, but riots broke out against them. Why? Well, they were still Jews. To these people, they were still Jews. This is really, because it's the first mass conversion that we saw. Remember, this did not happen in Central Europe, didn't happen in Western Europe, never needed to happen in Eastern Europe, that there was mass conversion. These were the Jews who mass converted. Whatever mass converted meant. Could be a whole synagogue of people. Could be thousands, it could be hundreds, we don't know. We have only best guesses that there were some hundreds of thousands of Jews in Spain. And you can read one book that says one thing and one that says the other. I think I told you Benjamin Netanyahu's father was a great scholar of this, and he wrote a definitive book, but they're still arguing about the numbers. These anti-conversos riots included laws, or led to laws that banned conversos, legitimate, that's what you called the good converts were called conversos, banned them and their descendants from holding office, from serving in the military, from collecting taxes. Some of them were there in effect until the 19th century. These laws, by the way, were not just directed at Jews, they included Moors, but they also prevented people from emigrating and leaving because they would want to take their money. And it went on and on and on like this. So it was not completely exclusive to Jews. It was becoming more and more so about the Jews. And the sphere of crypto Jews allowed its popularity to spread. It did eventually land in other places. And this it's an idea that found renewed vigor in the 19th century in Europe with the beginning of Central European anti-Semitism, and also in Eastern European places, which we'll look at as well. But before we leave class today, this all went right on time. I can't believe I did this all on time. I want to share my screen with you once again, because I want to give you an overview. We're finishing anything having to do right now with expulsion, per se, and I just want to give you an idea of where everybody went. So, because it's cogent to next week. I don't think I'm going to do that. I don't think I'm going to do a whole lot on the Inquisition. I had made that decision the first time. I think I'm going to stick to it. So just to remind you, we started with England in 1290. Where did they go? Many of them went into Central Europe, primarily into France. France is the nearest place, right? This, by the way, is available in Jacob Rader Marcus's book, The Jew in the Medieval World, which I think is still in print. I'm trying to get this a little larger. I realize it's kind of blurry on your end. France, we mentioned there were a number of expulsions, the final one having been at the end of the 14th century. Germany, we didn't really talk about. There were so many, and there were so many places in Germany that were not called Germany at the time. And so, but here today we've been talking about Spain. Look at where they went. They did go up through in Poland. They went here to Albany and all those kinds of places, Albania rather, all those areas. Here's the Greek Isles. Here's the Ottoman Empire. Here's Egypt. Here's the Maghreb, down in North Africa. They went to Portugal briefly, and that didn't last very long, some of them. But from Portugal, a number of them went to the Netherlands. And the story of the Jews of Netherlands is an incredible story, especially as the 15th, 16th, and the 16th century and the 17th century came. And the community there, which had two aspects to it. There was an Ashkenazic community and a Sephardic community. They never talked. That was true in the Ottoman Empire too. There was an Ashkenazic Jewish population there that went much later than this, but they never talked to the ones who were descended from Spanish. Each group believed they were better than the other. In the Netherlands, though, that's of course where Spinoza, that's where he was. One of the reasons it's famous, but not the only reason. I highly recommend a book about that period of the 17th century in England and the Netherlands, obviously very close to each other, and there was a lot of hopping back and forth. This, I believe, is where my great-grandmother's family, how they hopped over to England, because the Netherlands became an uncomfortable place for whatever reason for them, long before World War II. This happened in the 19th century, maybe earlier, and they hopped over to England. Lots of Jews from the Netherlands did go from England, and a lot of them were the Eastern European Jews who had left there around the 17 and 1800s when the Pale of Settlement, which we'll also look at, happened. So this is just Jews moving all around the world, going everywhere, hither and yon. The book I was going to tell you about, and I forgot the name of the author. She's wonderful. Her name is, I don't remember. It's called The Weight of Ink. Anybody ever read this book? We did it as the book club, the Temple Book Club did The Weight of Ink. I can look it up real quickly and tell you who it was, and then we'll end.
Rachel Kadish.
Yes, her. She's great. She's great. In fact, I had a question about something she discussed in the book, and I wrote to her, and she wrote back to me right away. And she said, yeah, I was right to be confused, and she wished she had written a few more sentences around it and had to do something with, where the Jews had come from and when. So it was relevant to what we're discussing. But she was, it wasn't that she was wrong. It was just that she left it a little bit unclear. Anyway, she's a fabulous writer, and it's a great book. I would say it's one of my top favorite Jewish books of all time.